Module 9, the peripheral nervous system, the sense of balance. Have you ever watched a toddler learning to stand up? They're pretty wobbly at first, aren't they? Well, as they're gaining control of their muscles, they're working to keep their balance. When you stand up, you don't wobble as much as you did when you were little, but if you watch yourself closely in a mirror, you might notice that you do bob and sway a bit. That's because you are using your muscles to maintain balance. And when a person needs to move, such as when a ballerina dances, balance is still maintained without falling over. This sense of balance is a very important one, and it is located in the inner ear. There are actually 3 areas of the ear: the external ear, middle ear, and the inner ear. The external ear comprises the ear shape you see on the side of your head into the location of the tympanic membrane, or the eardrum. This region is made up of the auricle, which is the part outside your head, along with the external auditory meatus, which is the canal leading to the eardrum. The middle ear is a small space that is filled with air containing the auditory ossicles, which are small bones within the ear. Now, the inner ear is what we will be focusing on in this section. It is a fluid-filled structure carved out of the temporal bone. This section of the ear can be further divided into 3 regions: the vestibule, the semicircular canals, and the cochlea. The cochlea looks kind of shell-shaped, and it is a very tiny coil, only about 2 millimeters wide. Remember, this area is a carved-out shape within the temporal bone. It is lined with a delicate layer of epithelium. Your sense of balance really has 2 facets. The first is the sense of static equilibrium, which determines the orientation of the head relative to the pull of gravity. In other words, it helps the body determine whether the head is being held straight up, bowed, leaning to one side, and so forth. The other sense is dynamic equilibrium, which helps determine the rotation and acceleration of the head. This allows us to maintain balance as we move. Well, since both of these senses occur in the inner ear, take a closer look at the vestibule. Here you will find the saccule, which means little sac. The utricle means little bag. They both have a spot on them called the macula. They are pink in this diagram. The utricular macula is oriented parallel at the base of the skull, and the saccular macula is oriented perpendicular to it. These 2 orientations help us to know how our head is positioned to gravity. If you close your eyes and tilt your head to the right, you know that your head is positioned in a different way than when it was upright, right? Well, taking a closer look at a macula, you can see that it is made of a gelatinous matrix with otoliths suspended in it. The prefix of that word oto refers to the ear, and the root lith means stone, so these are tiny ear stones. Additionally, in the matrix are hair cells that are supported by supporting cells. The hair cells, or cilia, are attached to associated sensory neurons. Now, all of these components, the otoliths, gelatinous matrix, hair cells, and support cells, all make up the maculae of both the saccule and the utricle. Macula literally means spot, and that's a good name for it because this structure is so tiny, it's not more than a few millimeters in length. So how do these tiny structures help us to maintain our balance? Looking at the hair cells, you can see that one hair is longer than the other ones. This longer one is the kinocilium. The rest of the hairs or cilia are called stereocilia. When you tip your head to one side, the comparatively heavy otoliths in the gelatinous matrix move down due to the pull of gravity. This causes the stereocilia to move. If they move toward the kinocilium, then the hair cell causes an action potential to occur on the sensory neuron. If the stereocilia move away from the kinocilium, then the hair cell stops making action potentials on the sensory neuron. So when the head is held in one position, the otoliths are in a specific orientation in the gelatinous matrix. This causes the stereocilia to create a standing pattern of action potentials on the neurons based on whether they have moved toward or away from the kinocilium. And this happens in both the maculae of the saccule and utricle. And when you change position of your head, the otoliths move, also creating a new set of action potentials based on how the stereocilia are being pushed against. So because one of the maculae is located horizontal to the skull base, and the other is oriented perpendicular to the skull base, and this is happening in both of your 2 inner ears, the otolith movement and the resulting change of the pattern of action potentials is enough information for your brain to figure out the position of your head with respect to the pull of gravity. Well, that is how static equilibrium works. Now we're going to look at dynamic equilibrium. This sense occurs in the inner ear as well, but it is a different function. It occurs in the semicircular canals. Notice how these three canals are oriented. Each is on a different plane. In the same way you might orient planes along an X, Y, and Z axis. The semicircular canals are also filled with fluid. At the end of these canals are ampullae, which contain the receptors that help us to identify dynamic equilibrium. Let's begin with the gelatinous cupula, which behaves just like a floating rubber duck. When the fluid moves, the cupula stimulates the crista ampullaris, where there are hair cells embedded in the cupula. When they are moved, they are creating action potentials on their associated neurons. So this sense has to do not with the stationary or static position of the head, but rather it responds to the movement of the head. When we tip our head, the fluid in the semicircular canals moves, which moves the cupula. Then the cupula will bump into the hair cells on the crista ampullaris, and they will be stimulated. This in turn will stimulate action potentials in the sensory neurons. Now, these neurons travel to the vestibular nucleus of the medulla oblongata in the central nervous system. This information is then sent to the cerebellum, which is in charge of adjusting our muscles for balance. Do you remember playing around with your equilibrium when you were younger? You likely didn't know that's what you were doing, but you spun around and around for a while and suddenly stopped. But even though you had stopped, the room continued to spin around for a bit. Well, now you can understand what was happening. As you spun, the fluid in the inner ear began to move. When you stopped, it kept moving due to the inertia that was generated. While it is continuing to flow, it keeps moving the cupula, which stimulates hair cells. So your dynamic equilibrium is telling your cerebellum that you are spinning. Additionally, the cupula and hair cell stimulation also creates a reflex in your eyes. They are conditioned to jump ahead of you as you turn. This is a reflex that helps you to see what's coming as you turn your head or spin around. When you overstimulated the hair cells in the semicircular canals by spinning around and around, you caused that reflex to happen. So while the fluid is moving rapidly in your inner ear, your cerebellum believes you are spinning around, and the eye reflex is triggered so that you see the room spin. If you try to walk forward during this time, you will have a difficult time of it because the cerebellum wants to adjust your muscles to stabilize your body because it thinks you're still spinning and you can't easily make your muscles move straight ahead. It's pretty fascinating when we can fool our brains into thinking one thing is happening when it really isn't, right? Well, in order to study balance, you see that it has to be separated into static and dynamic equilibrium. But our sense of balance requires more. We need our vision for sight, as well as our cutaneous receptors and proprioceptors for touch, pressure, and muscle control too. Your eyes play an important role in your balance. Think of figure skaters. They often spin around and around, but then stop spinning and begin to gracefully skate straight. How do they do that? Well, when they suddenly stop spinning, they focus their eyes on a single spot in the distance. This continual visual input helps to prevent them from getting dizzy, and they will maintain better balance.